God, as we come to your word, we long to be inspired. We long to be transformed and to see how we can better be your people to bring your life and your love to our world around us. Open our eyes, open our ears to the word you have in store for us today. Amen. Last week, Tori compared her sermon to a jigsaw puzzle, to the struggle of figuring out how to put all the pieces together. Well, this week, it felt more like peeling an onion. For each layer that you take off, it only makes you cry harder. Today in the story of Hagar, we are confronted with one of the scripture's texts of terror. One of the stories that makes you cringe and wonder, how did this end up in Israel's scriptures? Because all the expected characters, all the ones that represent God and God's people, they look horribly bad. They look like the people we would normally think of as God's enemies, as the people that God would usually punish, like the people that God usually rejects, the one God unseats from power in order to let the oppressed go free. Usually when we think of slavery in the scriptures, we think of Pharaoh in Egypt. They were the ones who enslaved the Israelites, the slaveholders, the oppressors. In the Bible, when we think of slavery, in our minds, we turn to the book of Exodus, where we read about God's act of liberation for God's people, a story that has inspired freedom movements throughout history, from the early Christians who suffered persecution and dreamed of an exodus, to the civil rights activists who dared to dream of freedom from racist America. Yet often, we forget that Abraham and Sarah were slaveholders too. We forget about Hagar, an enslaved woman, a gift to Abraham from an Egyptian pharaoh. Genesis 12 tells the story of a time when Abraham shared Sarah, his wife, as a concubine for Pharaoh, in hopes of finding favor in Pharaoh's eyes. And so, as a gesture of gratitude, as a form of repayment, the Pharaoh decides to share some of his slaves with Abraham. And Hagar, she was one of those slaves, one whose identity was tied to being a useful human for people with power, useful for Pharaoh, who wields Egyptian power, useful for Abraham, who wields God's power. And as the story progresses, Hagar is a victim, caught up in Abraham and Sarah's desperate attempt to fulfill God's promises. With God on their side, Sarah and Abraham, they feel entitled to use people, to use slaves, to use Hagar for their purposes. But when Hagar is no longer needed, when Hagar no longer suits the plans of the powerful, when Sarah is finally able to bear a son, Hagar and her child, they are quickly tossed aside, banished, left to die. Like I said, every layer of this story only makes you cry harder. The story of Hagar is one of those embarrassing stories of the Bible, an embarrassing story of Israel, yet somehow kept in the Bible as a story of the matriarchs and patriarchs. I don't know who is worst in our story. First, we hear Sarah's command to Abraham. Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. Notice how Sarah refuses to use their names. She refuses to speak the names of Hagar and Ishmael. She refuses to let them have names, to acknowledge that she knows them, that they are bound together by relationships. Sarah renders them nameless. She refers to Hagar as a as a generic slave, more like an object than a person. This slave woman, Sarah says, this slave woman, not your slave woman, Abraham, not my slave woman, not our slave, but this slave woman. As if Hagar has nothing to do with Sarah and her family. As if Sarah can just wash her hands of Hagar and Ishmael. As if there isn't any history between them. But there's part of me that feels sorry for Sarah. Here we have someone who was dragged halfway across the Middle East in pursuit of a destiny revealed to her husband, but never properly revealed to her. Here we have someone who was forced by her husband to be someone else's concubine on more than one occasion, because Abraham wanted to become friends with the powerful. But what excuse does Abraham have for listening to Sarah? For banishing Hagar and his son to the wilderness where they're going to die alone? And for sending them off with only meager provisions, which he knows will quickly run out? But God may look the worst of all. For God is the one who jumps onto the scene and tells Abraham to listen to Sarah. Whatever Sarah says to you, God says, do as she tells you. God is the one who intervenes, not by advocating for Hagar, but by backing Sarah's plan. It's a distressing portrait of God. No one comes out terribly well in our story today. But what about Hagar? What becomes of her? She survives. Hagar becomes a survivor of slavery, a survivor of other people using her body for their benefit. Against all odds, Hagar is given the tools she needs to fend for herself, to do what she needs to survive, to sustain herself and her son in the sweltering heat. I know this is not the outcome most of us want. We want an exodus for Hagar. We want God to liberate her with some grand act of deliverance, and for God to punish the slaveholders and restore justice. But as womanist theologian Dolores Williams points out, this is the reality that so many people and so many oppressed find true. And that's what's so refreshing about this text. People who have never experienced a God who miraculously rescued and freed them from their struggles. People whose most immediate need isn't a God to liberate them, but for a God to help them survive. For a God to come alongside so that they are given the tools to work towards their own survival. For God to give them the means for a better quality of life. I imagine Hagar wandering around the wilderness for days, clutching her starving child. She tries her best to ration their meager food. But as the days drag on, she recognizes that there's nothing more that she can do. She knows that first her only son is going to perish, and then her fate's going to soon follow. So she places her son under a bush. She turns away. She cannot bear the thought of looking any longer, and she just cries. You can feel the tears take effect when you hear Hagar wail, "Don't let me look on the death of the child." And then finally, God begins to act like God. For God hears her cry. Then God says her name, Hagar. Hagar, what is the matter? Do not be afraid. God says the one thing Sarah never could, her name, Hagar. And by uttering that word, God treats her as a person, a human being, someone deserving respect and honor. By uttering her name, God acknowledges her identity, her personhood. And then God opens Hagar's eyes, it says in verse 19, and she saw a well of water. That's all that God does in this story. God says her name, and then God enables her to see what is already there. But as Dolores Williams points out, that this is better than God saving her with a powerful act of compassion and justice. For that's the last thing women need, she argues. Instead, God empowers Hagar to provide for herself and her son. For after God opens Hagar's eyes, she herself does all the action. She becomes the subject of the verbs. Listen again to verse 19. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. She went, she filled, she gave. What if you were Hagar? What if you were not one of the chosen? What if you found yourself counted among the rejected ones? What if you were Hagar? This is the reality that so many women, especially African American women, know so well. There's a reason that the Black church calls her Black Hagar. There's a reason why Maya Angelou in her poem, The Mother Blackness, describes the daughter in the poem as Hagar's daughter. For Black women in this country know what it feels like to have no way out of slavery, no way of sparing your children the abuse of a cruel master, no way of surviving the world when you have no resources, no connection, no job, no way of protecting your children from violence, from abuse at the hands of an angry mob or a mistaken police officer or a self-appointed vigilante. No way of keeping their sons' lives from being decimated by prisons simply because they are Black. And yet, Black women also expect to be encountered by a God who will help them make a way out of no way. That's the story of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, Angela Davis, Alicia Garcia, and so many more. That's the story of Colette Flanagan, the founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, who I was privileged to get to know in Dallas. When her unarmed son, Clinton, was shot 6 times by the Dallas police in 2013, Colette turned her grief into anger, and then her anger into action. And in a matter of weeks, I watched her as she built Mothers Against Police Brutality into an intergenerational, multicultural organization with both a local and national presence. And that organization has been actively altering police policies and practices ever since. Black women have a centuries-long history of building and passing along the skills necessary to make a way out of no way. They have transmitted a faith in which they expect to encounter a God in times of needs, and they expect this God to empower them, not save them, not liberate them, but a God who will empower them so that they can liberate themselves to make a way out of no way. This morning, we are called to learn the way of Hagar, the way of surviving. This morning, we are called to grow in our capacity to make a way out of no way. One way we can do this, one way that we can encounter Hagar, is through the stories of African American women. Read their memoirs and their biographies. Read their academic writings. Most of all, look for the women like Colette Flanagan who are doing this work every day. I know there are women of color in our city who have honed the skills and cultivated the faith to make a way out of no way. Let us seize this opportunity to step up, learn from their experiences, and discover the countless and unimaginable ways that God gives us what we need to make a way out of no way. Why? Because Hagar's story is Jesus' story. Why? Because Jesus looks a lot more like Hagar than he does like Abraham. Think about it. Like Jesus, Hagar's suffering was brought about and brought on by those who were God's chosen people. Like Jesus, Hagar was cast out, banished, and in her greatest moment of deep agony, cried out, wondering why God had forsaken her. Hagar was a person who was despised, rejected, and well acquainted with grief. And just as God doesn't save Jesus from the cross, just as God doesn't come down, liberate Jesus, destroy Jesus' enemies, and make all things right, God doesn't do this for Hagar either. But in both stories, God does journey alongside and make a way out of no way. God empowers both in their time of greatest need. Are you looking for Jesus? Well, this morning in meeting Hagar, we found exactly where to find him. Amen.